Welcome back. My name is Charlie Vogel, Executive Director for Minnesota Wheat, and just want to thank everyone for attending the virtual 2020 Prairie Grain Session. We're in the afternoon breakout groups. So it's my privilege to introduce our speaker, Tom Peters. He's the Extension Sugarbeet Agronomist and Weed Control Specialist here at North Dakota State University on campus. So the title of his presentation is Prepare for a Battle because Pigweed Don't Play Dead. So welcome, Tom, and thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody had a good lunch, and I am going to do everything I can to make the afternoon session start real interesting for you. So if you've heard me speak before, there is a couple of themes in my presentation. So I like to talk about water hemp. Water hemp is my favorite weed. The second thing is I like to visit about an integrated system that combines the different crops that you have on the farm. So you might not be interested in sugar beets today, but I bet you're interested in wheat and soybean. And wheat and soybean are critical in this integrated weed management plan. I'm going to make two forecasts before I start. The first forecast is that water hemp is our Palmer amaranth. So the people in the South talk about Palmer amaranth as being this very significant weed that impacts their production. I believe in Minnesota and North Dakota, we're going to see water hemp do the same. And my second forecast is if we don't get aggressive in the next 2 to 3 years, I believe the next generation of farmers are going to change their practices because of water hemp. That's how important water hemp is for us. So I want to start by talking about college football. I really like college football, but this year I've watched very few games. And the reason is because I don't know that it's really the same as it usually has been. I'm not sure that the games matter. I don't know if there's going to be a playoff. To me, it's just a glorified scrimmage that's going on Saturdays. But I want to talk about pigweed. Pigweed will be prepared to play once spring comes. So I think it's critical that we use our winter meeting season to learn as much as we can about water hemp, to develop a strategy, to consider various options, and to be prepared to take decisive action, because that's what it requires to manage water hemp. This is one of my plots. So this is from a few years ago in west central Minnesota. And you can see the borders, the alleyways, and then the treatments in between. And sometimes universities come across as we have all the answers. So I'm going to tell you right now that we don't have the answers and we're not advancing.
There we go.
I'm not advancing. Okay. Thank you. Sorry for that. So we don't have all the answers, and an example of that is one of my own experiments. So this is a picture of an experiment near Moorhead from this past season, the 2020 season. And all you see is water hemp, because that's all that's there. There are no treatment effects. They're gone. And it just tells you that water hemp is that challenging, including challenging for university people. One of my friends is the extension specialist at Iowa State, Bob Hertzler. And Bob made an interesting comment in a conversation I had with him in the fall. And his comment was, is if we rely on herbicides alone, water hemp will be our #1 production problem. Not our #1 weed problem, our #1 production problem. That's a pretty lofty forecast. And I'm going to articulate some of the ideas that we've been developing collectively as we build a presentation today. So why is water hemp so difficult to manage? What makes it so different? What makes it so unique? And I think of water hemp as a weed that was born for the 21st century. So it is perfect, it fits perfectly into modern day agriculture. What do I mean? Well, a couple of things. So first of all, I believe that we spent a number of years challenging to identify water hemp. So when we only had a few plants in fields, and in scattered fields, we were misidentifying it. Number two, water hemp germinates and emerges all summer long. That's pretty unique with weeds. Number three, it grows very rapidly. And especially in an environment where climate is changing, where it's wetter than normal, where it's hotter than normal, that's going to be a very important situation. Number four, water hemp is well adapted to conservation tillage because it germinates off the surface and up to about 1.5 inches in soil. And finally, we're using a lot of post herbicides now. And again, a weed that germinates continuously is working around our post-emergence herbicide applications. So I'm going to talk for the next 5 minutes or so, the next 3 or 4 slides about biology. To me, biology is important. It's the starting point. It's about learning about your enemy, your foe. So we're going to talk about emergence. We're going to talk about identifying water hemp. We're going to talk about the reproductive features of water hemp. And then finally, the implications of that on the seed bank. So this is a slide that I've adapted from a couple of people. There's a timeline on the x-axis. The bars represent different weeds and when they emerge. And the width of the bars indicates the duration of emergence. So there's 2 pigweeds on the bottom, red pigweed and water hemp. They germinate and emerge much later than some of our other weeds like kochia or lamb's quarters. But look at the duration of emergence. And it's like I said, they are capable of emerging in response to rainfall starting in mid-May all the way through the month of July. Bob Hartzler developed some data in the mid-1990s, and they used velvet leaf. And it's interesting here that velvet leaf is more or less done emerging in the spring before water hemp even starts. But once water hemp starts emerging, look at how continuous it is over the weeks in June and July. Now, if you remember back to 2 slides, I mentioned that water hemp germinates around the 15th of May. And matter of fact, with my grower base, that's what we talk about, is to have a plan in place for when water hemp germinates and emerges around the 15th of May. Well, look at the slide top row middle. So it says May 2nd, Mapleton, North Dakota. And it's a picture from one of our agriculturalists, and it's water hemp germinating and emerging at Mapleton, North Dakota, May 2nd. So I thought it was a fluke. It had something to do with what was going on last year, maybe our weather patterns that we had in 2019, especially in the fall. But over the next several weeks, there were many more pictures that came in that showed the exact same thing that we observed at Mapleton. all of these pictures came before when I had previously mentioned water hemp germinates and emerges. So there's something that was different in 2020, quite frankly, that we still don't understand. But we're going to make some adjustments based on what we saw in 2020. Weed identification, this is critical. So first of all, water hemp doesn't have any hairs on its leaves or stem. The pigweed, red pigweed does. The other thing that I like to teach and train, and red pigweed is on the right, the cotyledons on red pigweed are like canoes. They're long and narrow. And contrast that with water hemp, the cotyledons are more like rowboats. They're wider and narrower. And then look at the first true leaves. The red pigweed leaves are more round. The water hemp leaves are lanceolate shaped. As water hemp grows and develops, it's a much deeper shade of green with waxes on the surface than red pigweed. And remember what I said about hairs. Weed identification is critical. And what I like to say is if you're not sure, ask for help. Okay, these are pollen grains. They're not golf balls. They're pollen grains from both water hemp and Palmer amaranth. Both of these, water hemp and Palmer amaranth, are what the biologists call dioecious plants. Dioecious. So what that means is there's male plants and there's female plants. So the reproductive organs are on male plants and the same for female plants. The other thing that's really interesting about water hemp is that the pollen from a male is viable for 5 days. So it can be floating around and it can move about a half mile to find a female plant. And I believe that's why we have so much diversity. It's the fact that we have dioecious male and female plants, and pollen is capable of moving and temporally interacting with the female plants. So what are the consequences of this? It's plant diversity. This is kochia, it's not water hemp, but this same diversity that we have in kochia exists in water hemp as well. And look at the pictures of the stems. We see the same thing with different shades of color in stems of water hemp. But the biggest implication to dioecious plants and its reproductive habit is weed resistance. And I would suggest that that's the biggest challenge that we have in corn, soybean, wheat, and sugar beet production is resistant biotypes of water hemp. The gold bars in the graph happen to be pigweed species. So if these are different families or different weeds with resistance, the top being 15 different families of herbicides where there's resistance, you can see that the pigweed species are very prominent in weed resistance challenges. So one of the other things that's interesting about pigweeds, not only the dioecious point, because some of them are monoecious, is they make a lot of seed. So we're looking at 4 different pigweeds here. This is Missouri data, red pigweed, water hemp, smooth pigweed, and Palmer. And all of these pigweeds, each plant makes at least 250,000 seed. And contrast that to one of our highest yielding corn hybrids where you get about 750 kernels. So seed production is an important feature of water hemp. And I think that leads to some of the resistance challenges we have. The second challenge that it leads to is it's seed that remains viable in the soil. This is the comment about the seed bank. So once we have seed entering the seed bank, it's going to remain viable for at least 4 years. And that means we have to put together multiple years in order to control it. Okay, we're about halfway into the talk, and I finally got to my most important slide. So if you have your cell phone handy, take a picture of this slide, because there's some things on this slide that I'm going to, I think are really critical for crop production. So number one, don't develop a single weed control program for water hemp. You need to develop a program for each field. And it's based on your cropping history. It's based on what you intend to plant next. It's based on the weed pressure you have in field. So farming by the averages, where we do the same thing over and over, doesn't work for water hemp. We need to personalize control for each field that we're in. Number two, plan. Plan your crop sequences. Map out what crops you intend to plant. Map out what herbicide options you have, especially for important weeds in those fields. Record keeping is just as important as it is for keeping yield records. So plan your sequences, map out the herbicides, and introduce as much herbicide diversity as you can. Number three, if you have to, bury the seed. And I'll talk more about that later, but hit the reset button and start over. Bury the seed. Number four, tailor your programs. And what I mean by that is pick out the nozzles and water volumes that match up to weeds, weed sizes, and the herbicides that you're using. And number five, the last one, attack. Don't rely just on herbicides. Take an integrated approach. I'm a believer that every farm, every field on a farm should have at least 3 crops. 4 is even better. And the reason for that is crops create variety. It makes it more difficult for weeds, especially water hemp. So we plant crops differently, we fertilize them different, they make different kinds of residue. It makes it more confusing for weeds. So get your team members on board. If you need to talk to your business partners, your bankers, your partners, I would encourage you to talk about the need to get more cropping diversity. One of the things that I observed when I was driving last year was to prevent plant fields. So unfortunately, we didn't get tillage in those fields in a timely manner. And I think if you have prevent plant fields, especially fields with weeds, where weeds went to seed, be very, very thoughtful about what crop that you plant in those fields. Absolutely don't plant sugar beets in that field. Will never be successful. But wheat and maybe corn, I think, are good options because of the biology of the crop and also the herbicide options. We have a technical bulletin. It's called Herbicide Resistant Traits. And what it's designed to do is to organize all the traits that are available in the crops that we grow in Minnesota and North Dakota. So this is called PS 1945. We're in the process of updating it. And I would encourage you to look for this if you're looking for a herbicide trait that might be an advantage. Maybe it's another mode of action. Maybe it's a way to get a second important weed in the field. So I mentioned when I started that I like to visit about integrated weed management. Integrated to me means linked or coordinated. And it can be using different methods of weed management, like chemical, mechanical, or cultural, but it can also be some of the practices that we use in the season. For example, mixtures of herbicides, or maybe sequential applications. So we'll visit about a couple of these in the remaining time. So the line in the middle, the line right above the timeline, is the traditional herbicide program that we've used in sugar beets. So it's 2, maybe 3 post-emergent sprays. So that program no longer works for water hemp. We're using the layered program where we're putting soil residual herbicides on that are timed to water hemp germination and emergence. And you can see we're even adding a pre. The pre was not a requirement in the program. We're going to make it a requirement due to that observation that we had from 2020, early this spring. Nozzles. To me, nozzles are a compromise. Some of our products that we use now require certain droplet size, and that requires certain nozzles. I think it's just as important to consider the coverage that you get. So choosing a nozzle is a combination of a droplet size, but also the coverage that you get. And then when you match up and create mixtures, you have to find optimization. So of course, dicamba and 2,4-D are going to be the alpha products. We have to use the nozzles that are recommended on the labels, but there's a little bit of flexibility, especially in volume, spray volume. And I think that's where you can introduce the second herbicides and play to their strengths. In the case of Liberty, it's good coverage. And here's an example of that. It's the difference between going from 10 to 20 gallons per acre. And as we make bigger droplets for 2,4-D and dicamba, you can see where the added spray volume is going to benefit overall control. Be careful about unintended events. So sometimes mixtures creates antagonism, especially when you couple in concerns with water quality, as we're not using ammonium sulfate as much, especially when we're using dicamba. So I saw more barnyard grass in 2020 than I've ever seen before. To me, that's an unintended consequence of using some mixtures. So be aware of those and certainly plan and respond to those. I mentioned about burying seed. So look at the size of corn as it compares to water hemp. On the table, there's emergence that are coming off the surface to 1.5 inches. So in the case of no tillage, 81% of the seeds are emerging from that zone. Minimum till in this example, in this research, was vertical tillage. The same, over 80% emergence from that 0 to 1.5 inch area. Conventional happened to be fall chisel plowing followed by spring cultivation. The same thing, over 80% control. The only time that we buried seed is when we got out the moldboard plow. Yes, I said it. I said go out with a plow. So this is something that you're not going to want to do all the time. But if you get into a situation where you just have to do something extraordinary, the moldboard plow is going to bury that seed so you can start over. I've got just a couple of slides left, and I want to talk about cultural practices. So one area that I'm interested in is the crop benefiting weed control. And we especially see this in sugar beet, where our sugar beet leaves cover the canopy and they prevent late season germination occurring. So I asked the question of the soybean breeder, can we buy soybean varieties that emerge quicker or develop a canopy quicker? And the answer is no. So my question is why not? Why can't we start to develop these tools? And in the meantime, rows that are spaced narrower together, drilled beans or beans on 15-inch rows, as you can see on the y-axis, means less water hemp escapes that are coming in compared to planting on 30-inch rows. And another idea that's related to that is the population or the density that we plant at. And you can see by just stepping up from 130 to 160, we significantly reduce the amount of late season water hemp. And again, I'm attributing that to the plant itself. It's the biology of the plant. So let's summarize 5 quick bullets for you. First of all, use the winter to study your enemy. Start with learning about its biology. Number 2, personalize. It's not a one-size-fits-all proposition. Personalize weed management and do that with number 3 by planning your sequences and the herbicides you use and mixing in mechanical and cultural practices. Number 4, be prepared for the unexpected. Maybe shifts in weeds like we've observed with barnyard grass. And number 5, don't be afraid to make adjustments if something doesn't work correctly. So my contact information is here. I'm on Twitter. Call me, send me an email. I'd really enjoy to visit with you if you have any questions. Thank you.